ripple echo.
And we all have this feeling that I came into this world. Now, it isn't true. You came out of this world.
In our last episode, we watched a federal court push back on executive trade authority. But the legal ammunition behind that decision came from a law that was never meant to be used this way. This episode, we leave the courtroom behind and walk straight into a demolition site. The Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, wasn't passed by Congress. It was signed into existence, handed sweeping powers, and placed under the unofficial leadership of the world's most polarizing technologist. It promised $1 trillion in savings. It delivered firings, fury, and a 130-day sprint toward institutional revolt. I'm sure the machine has plenty to say about this.
Okay, picture a scene right after a major election. You've got the richest man in the world standing there in the Oval Office, full of ambition, promising something like a Manhattan Project for government reform.
Right.
The idea. Slash trillions from government waste, fundamentally fix Washington's bureaucracy, almost like, updating a buggy piece of software with a really disruptive tech approach. But then, well, the sources tell a very different story about what actually happened next.
Yeah, what you're describing really sets the stage perfectly for the incredibly audacious vision behind the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, as it became known.
DOGE, right?
It was an initiative born not from traditional legislative channels, but largely from executive orders. And it was specifically designed, it seems, to facilitate really rapid disruptive change.
Okay.
The core concept was basically to bring in significant outside expertise, spearheaded, of course, by Elon Musk. He's a figure widely synonymous with challenging norms and known for that aggressive, rapid corporate restructuring style.
Like at Twitter, for instance.
Exactly. And the ambition, as you said, was just sky high. The tactics they employed were often, well, controversial. And the subsequent collision with Washington's deeply entrenched bureaucracy, its legal system, and just the fundamental political realities proved to be, shall we say, immensely impactful.
Impactful feels like maybe an understatement based on these sources we have. We've got official documents, detailed analyses from watchdog groups, extensive media reports, and even commentary from conservative voices.
Right.
We're going to meticulously pull out the most important insights, nuggets of information to understand the very short, incredibly tumultuous life of DOGE. We'll start by looking at how it was initially conceived and legally established, its unconventional structure, and the specific, often quite aggressive tactics it employed under Musk's incredibly prominent, though officially ambiguous, leadership.
And then we'll trace its seemingly inevitable collision with the political system. That includes significant pushback from the courts, a growing backlash from the public and the federal workforce itself, and how the initiative attempted, often unsuccessfully, to navigate the complex legislative landscape, including its notable and, frankly, revealing absence from a major budget bill later in the year.
And perhaps most importantly, we'll scrutinize those highly touted claimed savings. The big numbers Musk and the administration were frequently comparing them directly against independent analyses that often suggested a vastly different picture, potentially even showing that DOGE incurred a net cost to the government.
Exactly.
Ultimately, we'll consider what this rapid rise and fall of DOGE tells us about the inherent challenges and maybe the fundamental nature of attempting radical outside-in reform within the established structures of Washington.
And the stakes here are indeed significant. This goes far beyond just government accounting or, a bureaucratic dust-up. This entire episode is really a powerful case study in what happens when a high-efficiency, seemingly technocratic experiment championed by a powerful private sector figure with significant political ties meets the often slow, deeply complex, and politically charged environment of Washington.
Right.
What does the relatively swift demise of DOGE say about the federal government's institutional immune system, so to speak? What are the consequences, both intended and unintended, when an executive initiative attempts to fundamentally bypass traditional legislative processes and congressional oversight? And what does this reveal about the deep partisan divides and the often crippling internal political conflicts that can hamstring even seemingly popular goals like, say, reducing government waste? This is, at its core, a look at ambitious technocratic ideas hitting the hard, messy wall of political reality.
And our mission, using only the information and the sources you've gathered, is to help you understand the vision behind DOGE, the specific actions taken, the multitude of critiques and challenges they faced, and ultimately, why this highly publicized effort failed to achieve its most ambitious stated goals.
Okay, let's jump right in and start at the very beginning of this story.
Chapter 1. The birth of DOGE, vision, structure, and Musk's mission.
So the genesis of this initiative, as the sources lay out, really traces back quite directly to President Trump's post-election vows in late 2024. He made very public promises to the American people, stating his intention to dismantle government bureaucracy and strip away what he termed the deep state.
Right, that language was everywhere.
It was. And this rhetoric immediately established a highly confrontational anti-establishment posture that clearly set the stage for the kind of approach DOGE would take.
And those promises didn't just remain rhetoric for long, did they?
That's right. The sources highlight significant discussions happening in late 2024 between President-elect Trump and Elon Musk. Now, Musk was already a globally recognized private sector figure, known for disrupting industries like electric vehicles with Tesla and space travel with SpaceX, often through, aggressive, unconventional methods.
And importantly, he was also Trump's largest campaign donor.
Critically, he was Trump's single largest campaign donor in the preceding year. This close relationship, underscored by that significant financial support, likely afforded him a level of influence and direct access that went way beyond any formal title he might eventually hold.
And he was quickly tapped to co-lead this effort, which was initially framed in almost revelationary terms. The language used was striking things like a transformative effort, even a Manhattan Project for government reform, evoking the sense of national urgency and like a moonshot level of ambition.
Exactly. And right alongside that grand framing came initial promises of truly massive spending cuts. The figures floated were incredibly ambitious, if maybe somewhat undefined at the very beginning. Figures as high as $1 trillion or even $2 trillion were publicly mentioned as potential targets.
$1 trillion! That's just an almost unfathomable number for government savings.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that pattern, of starting with incredibly grand, often shifting declarations, followed by later revisions, is something the sources show recurred throughout DOGE's relatively short lifespan.
Okay.
The official rhetoric accompanying the launch was also explicitly political and ideological. It spoke of returning power back to the American people and framed the effort as cleaning out the deep state, firing rogue bureaucrats and career politicians, and targeting government corruption.
So not subtle.
Not subtle at all. This wasn't presented purely as a fiscal exercise. It established a clear anti-establishment, almost combative posture from day one, targeting specific perceived enemies within the system.
And Musk's selection was absolutely central to delivering that message and embodying that approach, wasn't it? I mean, he's a billionaire entrepreneur known for industry disruption, for explicitly challenging norms, and for being highly critical of government regulation. His very involvement felt symbolic of the disruptive, outsider-led approach they intended to take.
Absolutely. The initiative was also described as relying heavily on advice and guidance from outside of government, specifically partnering with the White House and the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB.
Right, OMB.
Which is the agency responsible for preparing the president's budget and overseeing agency performance. The idea was to explicitly introduce fresh perspectives from outside the traditional government structures. But the sources immediately point out a clear inherent contrast between Musk's professional background, characterized by rapid, aggressive corporate restructuring, perhaps most visibly at Twitter, and the fundamental realities of government operations. Government is bound by this incredibly intricate web of laws, regulations, long-standing civil service protections, and complex accountability structures that are just fundamentally different from the private sector. This inherent divergence in operating models and constraints clearly foreshadowed the potential conflicts that would and did arise.
So beyond the soaring rhetoric and the anti-establishment framing, what were the specific stated purpose and operational goals of DOGE according to these sources?
Well, the primary stated purpose was to instill greater accountability and transparency in federal spending, with the overarching aim of ensuring taxpayer dollars were used wisely and effectively. Operationally, a key objective was modernizing federal IT and software systems to maximize efficiency and productivity across agencies.
Okay, IT modernization, that makes sense.
Yeah, this included improving outdated IT systems, promoting interoperability between disparate agency networks, and ensuring robust data integrity.
But it wasn't just about technology and money, right? There was a very strong, explicit focus on reforming or maybe reducing the bureaucracy itself.
That's correct. Bureaucratic reform was a major, highly visible component. The stated goal was to reshape the government bureaucracy to be more responsive. This involved implementing measures like a freeze on the hiring of bureaucrats, though with necessary exceptions for certain essential areas.
Okay.
And notably, the sources point to a specific, highly controversial intention stated right within the initiative's goals to end the onslaught of useless and overpaid DEI activists buried into the federal workforce.
Wow, that's explicit.
Very explicit. This direct targeting of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives clearly signaled that DOGE's definition of efficiency was being applied not just through a fiscal lens, but also through a distinct ideological one.
That definitely seems to align directly with the earlier anti-establishment rhetoric and the promise to clean out the deep state.
Yes, and tied into that, there was a clear mandate for agencies to align their spending and personnel decisions with the administration's specific policies, further underscoring that significant political and ideological dimension woven throughout the initiative.
Right.
The specific stated goals included that drastic spending reduction, with those initial $1 trillion to $2 trillion targets, later revised downward to a more concrete figure of $150 billion for the current fiscal year, and then claimed as $175 billion achieved by May 29, 2025.
So a big drop from the initial numbers, but still huge.
Still very large.
Yeah.
And despite these revisions downward from the initial astronomical figures, Musk publicly insisted that DOGE would relentlessly pursue $1 trillion in reductions over a longer time frame.
And ultimately, the broader goal was framed as a way to achieve U.S. national debt reduction and significant federal workforce downsizing, explicitly reducing employees to cut perceived wasteful spending.
Right. And tied back to that ideological component, they had a detailed, explicit plan for eliminating DEI initiatives across the government. This involved rescinding specific executive orders, dissolving offices and committees deemed focused on DEI, terminating personnel labeled as DEI-related, and removing associated materials from federal platforms. It was quite comprehensive.
So how was this ambitious and at times controversial plan actually put into effect legally? Was DOGE established as a traditional cabinet department, like, say, the Department of Justice or the Department of Energy?
Not at all. That's a key point consistently highlighted across the sources. DOGE was formally established and granted its authority primarily through executive orders issued by the president.
Okay, EOs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This approach indicated a clear strategic preference for bypassing the traditional legislative process and congressional oversight that would normally be required to create a new cabinet-level department. Executive Order 14158, issued on January 20, 2025, titled Establishing and Implementing the President's Department of Government Efficiency, was foundational.
Right.
It didn't create an entirely new entity from scratch. Instead, it reorganized the existing U.S. Digital Service, or USDS, which was already located within the Executive Office of the President, or EOP, that's the group of agencies and offices directly supporting the President, into the new U.S. DOGE service, also still abbreviated USDS.
Okay, so it repurposed an existing structure already under the president's direct control. That's clever, in a way.
It was, structurally. That same EO also established the U.S. DOGE Service Temporary Organization, or USDSTO, which was intended to serve as the operational core specifically dedicated to the President's 18-month DOGE agenda. This temporary nature, notably set to terminate on July 4, 2026, likely contributed to a sense of urgency and potentially incentivized rapid, perhaps even hasty action to show results within that specific time frame.
Right, a ticking clock.
Exactly. The EO also mandated the creation of DOGE teams directly within federal agencies and directed the newly reorganized USDS to implement a broad software modernization initiative. And crucially, it granted the USDS, and by extension DOGE, full and prompt access to all unclassified agency records, software systems, and IT systems.
Wow. That sounds like incredibly sweeping access right from day one, cutting across the normal lines of agency control.
It was. And the sources highlight how that authority was further augmented by a second significant executive order, EO 14222, issued on February 26, 2025, titled Implementing the President's Department of Government Efficiency Cost Efficiency Initiative.
Okay.
This order significantly expanded DOGE's powers, giving it greater authority over contract termination and directing changes to agency operations. It required agencies to adopt centralized payment and travel systems with built-in justification requirements and notably pause capabilities for agency heads.
A pause button on spending.
Essentially, yes. It also mandated the review, and if deemed appropriate, termination or modification of contracts and grants, specifically to reduce spending or to advance administration policies, again explicitly embedding that political dimension into financial decisions.
Right.
Agencies were also ordered to conduct a full inventory of federal real property and develop a plan for disposing of unneeded assets. And in a very tangible move, the order imposed a short-term 30-day freeze on federal employee credit cards, with exceptions for critical operations.
Wow. Freezing employee credit cards, that's a very direct and potentially disruptive action. Were there other executive orders involved besides those two main ones?
Yes, the sources mention additional EOs were issued, though details are more limited. They related specifically to agency HR management, including imposing federal hiring freezes and requiring new hiring plans aligned with DOGE's goals. Now, this heavy reliance on executive orders to establish such sweeping authority, particularly over funds that Congress had already appropriated and directed towards specific programs and activities, immediately raised fundamental questions about legality and constitutionality, especially regarding the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches.
Yeah, I can see that.
The sources specifically note that the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, which is a nonpartisan congressional watchdog agency, initiated investigations into instances of alleged improper fund freezing by DOGE. Furthermore, numerous legal challenges were quickly filed against DOGE's actions, all underscoring these significant constitutional and legal concerns. Table 1 in the sources lists these key executive orders and their specific dates and mandates, clearly illustrating that the foundational authority for DOGE was built primarily on presidential decree rather than an act of Congress.
Oh, no. Okay, so let's quickly recap the foundation of DOGE. Remember, as you just heard, it wasn't a traditional cabinet department created by Congress, but an initiative born from a series of executive orders. Its initial targets were truly massive savings, and its structure was specifically designed to embed its influence directly into agencies across the government, all spearheaded by the very public figure of Elon Musk. So, with this structure and Musk at the helm, what was the organizational blueprint exactly, and who were the key players beyond Musk?
Well, the organizational blueprint centered around that US DOGE service, the USDS, which, as we mentioned, was the reorganized existing EOP US digital service.
Right.
This provided it with an established, though small, framework already within the executive branch and reporting directly to the White House. The USDS administrator, a position held by Amy Gleason as acting administrator, reported directly to the White House Chief of Staff.
Okay, straight to the top.
Exactly. This direct reporting line signified incredibly close White House control and oversight over the initiative's daily operations.
And that temporary organization, the USDSTO, how did that fit in operationally?
That was designed as the primary operational core intended to drive the president's specific 18-month DOGE agenda, with that fixed July 4, 2026 termination date we mentioned. This temporary nature was very likely intended to incentivize aggressive and rapid action, potentially prioritizing speed over more meticulous due process or careful consideration as they were operating against that ticking clock.
So a sense of urgency was structurally built into the core team. And how did they extend their reach directly into the thousands of federal employees working in the agencies?
Right. So Executive Order 14158 mandated the establishment of agency DOGE teams within each federal agency. These teams were typically composed of a lead, an engineer, an HR specialist, and an attorney. These team members could be existing agency personnel detailed to DOGE, or they could be brought in as special government employees. Their role was to coordinate with the central USDS and advise agency heads on implementing the DOGE agenda. This structure effectively embedded DOGE's influence directly throughout the federal bureaucracy, giving the central DOGE team significant leverage.
How so?
Well, the sources note that agency DOGE team leads were even required to consult with the central USDS administrator regarding new career appointments within their agency and report monthly on hiring actions.
That sounds like a very centralized model, putting White House-aligned control directly into the agency's personnel decisions and operations.
It was, but the sources also highlight the significant risks involved with this model. The reliance on often inexperienced personnel, informally dubbed DOGE kids in some reports, with many reportedly aged 19 to 24, with little to no prior government experience embedded within agencies.
Wow, 19 years old.
Yeah, coupled with those incredibly broad mandates for data access and operational changes, created substantial risk for inconsistent application of policy, potential abuse of power, and significant operational disruptions simply due to a lack of understanding of how complex agencies actually function.
Right.
The rapid, sweeping changes they attempted often suggested a lack of nuanced understanding of specific agency missions, legal constraints, and operational contexts, contributing to reported chaotic outcomes on the ground.
Let's circle back to the central figure, Elon Musk. What was his precise role? It sounds like it evolved or was always somewhat ambiguous.
Unequivocally, Elon Musk was the central figure publicly spearheading the DOGE initiative. President Trump himself referred to DOGE as his baby, a sentiment Musk appeared to embrace, even famously wearing a "The Doge Father" t-shirt during a public appearance.
Aha, right.
His official designation was that of a special government employee, a status typically limited to 130 days of service within a year to avoid conflict of interest issues, and he was formally described as a senior advisor.
Okay, just an advisor.
Officially. While the White House publicly asserted he lacked formal authority to make government decisions, President Trump consistently portrayed him as being in charge of DOGE, and one court even declared him the de facto leader of the initiative based on his actions and influence. This ambiguity surrounding his precise official capacity versus his perceived and actual operational control was a consistent theme throughout his tenure.
And we mentioned his status as a top campaign donor earlier, which certainly adds another layer to his influence and access, doesn't it?
Yes, definitely. Initially, Vivek Ramaswamy, another prominent figure, was announced as a co-leader alongside Musk. However, the sources note that Ramaswamy departed the initiative relatively early around the time of the inauguration in January 2025, reportedly to pursue elected office in Ohio. This departure, and some reports of a feud between Ramaswamy and Musk, left Musk as the sole prominent figurehead of DOGE, essentially consolidating power in his hands. Other individuals noted as key figures in the DOGE effort included Steve Davis, Katie Miller, and James Burnham, who were also reportedly planning their departure around the same time as Musk's term expired. The sources also point out that some chief information officers, CIOs, appointed in key agencies like the OMB, the Office of Personnel Management, or OPM.
Right, OPM manages the civil service.
Exactly, and also the Department of Energy, DOE, and the Social Security Administration, SSA. Some of these CIOs reportedly had connections to either Musk or Peter Thiel, suggesting a potential network of ideologically aligned individuals being placed in pivotal IT and administrative roles across the government.
Interesting. And that pervasive data access we discussed from the executive orders, how central was that?
That was critical to DOGE's operational approach. USDS was granted full and prompt access to all unclassified agency records, software systems, and IT systems. Reports even indicated that in some instances, DOGE personnel accessed potentially classified information, raising significant concerns.
Wow.
This extensive access facilitated their ability to scrutinize operations and direct changes within agencies. And again, that defined termination date of the USDSTO, July 4, 2026, likely acted as a catalyst for aggressive and rapid action, potentially incentivizing speed over meticulous due process or coordination.
Okay, so thinking about all that foundation we just laid out, the vision, the structure, Musk's role, the broad powers, what are the couple of big picture ideas we should keep in mind moving forward?
Right, the core ideas here are that DOGE was intentionally designed outside traditional legislative channels, given sweeping powers via executive order, aimed at massive cost savings that were stated with immense initial ambition, and strategically structured to embed its influence directly within existing federal agencies. All of this was prominently led by Elon Musk, embodying a disruptive, outsider-driven approach.
So with this structure and Musk at the helm, what were some of his most notable key actions and guiding philosophies in those early days?
Well, President Trump publicly credited Musk with instigating a colossal change in the old ways of doing business in Washington. A core, highly visible element of Musk's approach was the rapid implementation of mass layoffs and firings across numerous federal agencies almost immediately after DOGE was established.
Right out of the gate.
Right. He consistently championed drastic federal spending cuts, with those initial sights on that ambitious $1 trillion to $2 trillion in reductions.
And he had this rather unique, almost philosophical take on the initiative, didn't he? Referring to it as a way of life.
Yes. Musk famously stated, DOGE is a way of life, like Buddhism. This suggests an ambition for something far deeper than just procedural adjustments. He seemed to want to instill a fundamental cultural shift within the federal government itself. His leadership saw the explicit targeting of specific programs and even entire agencies for cuts or closure, with the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID.
Foreign aid, right.
Exactly. And various Mine Safety and Health Administration, or MSHA, offices being prominent early examples.
We also heard about how he seemed to mirror some tactics he'd used in his corporate life, particularly at Twitter.
Exactly. Mirroring tactics he employed after acquiring Twitter, Musk utilized Office of Personnel Management Systems, OPM, the agency managing the Federal Civil Service, to send mass emails to federal employees, like the infamous fork in the road email, offering a deferred resignation program.
Right, I remember that.
He also publicly championed DOGE's wall of receipts as a model of transparency for its claimed savings, despite significant later criticisms regarding its accuracy and methodology, which we'll definitely get into.
Okay.
His leadership style was widely characterized by an aggressive, almost shock therapy approach to cost cutting, explicitly drawing those parallels to rapid corporate restructuring. This rapid, often drastic approach can be seen as an attempt to apply a shock doctrine to government reform, creating or leveraging a perceived crisis, in this case government waste and the national debt, to justify and push through radical sweeping changes swiftly.
So manufacturing urgency.
Well, both Musk and Trump employed catastrophic rhetoric, such as the claim that America will go bankrupt without such drastic measures, to justify these extreme actions and create that sense of urgency.
Wow. Framing government efficiency as a crisis requiring that level of shock therapy, that definitely sets the stage for some major conflict, which is exactly what happened almost immediately, as the sources detail.
Yes, the collision was swift and intense.
Micro recap 1. Okay, so far, we've seen how DOGE was born out of these really ambitious goals, legally established through executive orders rather than Congress, and structured to give Elon Musk and his team broad access and authority. They aim to implement rapid, disruptive changes across the federal government, targeting everything from IT systems to the workforce itself and specific programs, all framed as this urgent path to efficiency and debt reduction, using tactics that really mirrored aggressive corporate restructuring.
That's a good summary of this setup.
End of chapter, mega recap 1. To quickly sum up this first phase, DOGE burst onto the scene with a vision of transforming government efficiency through swift, outsider-led action. This was backed by presidential authority and incredibly ambitious, though shifting, savings targets. However, the structure, the reliance on executive orders, and the aggressive ideological framing immediately set it up for conflict with the established norms and legal structures of Washington. The groundwork was definitely laid for a major clash.
Absolutely.
So let's get into that clash. Chapter 2, Gridlock and Ghosting. How bipartisan dysfunction killed reform.
Right. From the very moment DOGE was launched with this aggressive, disruptive posture, early disruptions and clashes within the agencies were almost immediate and quite dramatic, according to the sources. Musk and his team wasted no time. Within the very first week, in late January 2025, DOGE operatives began showing up unannounced at agencies, starting with the General Services Administration, or GSA.
GSA manages federal buildings, procurement.
Exactly. They arrived to interrogate staff and demand immediate data access.
That must have been incredibly jarring and disruptive for the people working in those offices, just having people show up like that.
Absolutely, and it escalated incredibly quickly from there. On January 28th, the now infamous fork in the road email was sent out.
Right.
This mass email sent to over 2 million federal workers using Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, systems was incredibly blunt. It asked employees point blank, what did you accomplish this week? And strongly urged many to take buyouts and resign, implying they might be fired if they stayed. This marked the rapid beginning of mass layoffs, with thousands of federal employees across various agencies receiving pink slips or pressured retirement offers that very week. The administration claimed these cuts were targeting waste, but the sudden, sweeping nature of the termination spread widespread anxiety and demoralization across the entire federal workforce.
And it wasn't just the GSA feeling the pressure. Other agencies saw immediate drastic action too.
No, the sources highlight that early February 2025 saw direct agency showdowns. Musk's DOGE team stormed into the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, which handles foreign aid programs, with the explicit aim of enforcing deep cuts.
Okay.
They were met with resistance. Security officials at USAID reportedly initially barred Musk's people from accessing a secure data room, leading to a heated standoff. DOGE ultimately prevailed in gaining access, and the agency's security chief was subsequently placed on leave for resisting their entry.
So resistance was punished.
It appears so. What followed was described as the rapid hollowing out of America's largest foreign aid agency. Over 5,600 USAID employees worldwide were reportedly fired in a matter of weeks.
5,600. And Musk didn't exactly try to downplay that action, did he?
Far from it. The sources report Musk actually bragged about this purge on his social media platform, X, gleefully comparing it to feeding USAID into the wood chipper.
Grief.
This incredibly brazen language and drastic actions signaled to the entire government that no corner, even programs focused on fighting poverty or responding to global disasters, was off limits to DOGE's acts. It also revealed the administration's willingness to override or sideline internal checks and balances. By removing USAID's security official and effectively forcing out agency leadership, Musk's team showed it would remove anyone perceived as getting in the way of their rapid changes.
Then there was that sudden, seemingly impulsive move against a specific federal tech office. What was that about?
Yes, that incident, highlighted in the sources, occurred on February 3rd, 2025, and really showcased Musk's impulsive, social media-driven management style brought into government. After a right-wing influencer posted on X, formerly Twitter, accusing a specific GSA tech unit called 18F of harboring radical leftists, Musk announced on X that 18F was deleted.
Just like that on social media.
Just like that. In reality, overnight on March 1st, DOGE did indeed lay off the entire staff of 18F. This was a unit responsible for developing modern federal software and services, including the working prototype for the IRS's free e-filing system. This flippant decision, reportedly made in direct response to online rumors without apparent due process or consultation with GSA leadership, was alarming.
So vital tech expertise was eliminated based seemingly on a social media post. That sounds incredibly reckless.
That's what the sources indicate. Vital tech expertise was lost almost instantly, prompting significant alarm that critical government IT projects could be severely disrupted. One official was quoted as quipping that Musk seemed to be axing genuinely useful programs based on misinformation and online accusations. This incident certainly spread fear and uncertainty through federal tech circles and clearly foreshadowed the legal challenges that would soon emerge over DOGE's hiring and firing practices.
It seems like these early drastic actions only emboldened Musk to push for even more sweeping changes.
Absolutely. By mid-February 2025, he began openly musing about deleting entire government agencies. In a speech on February 13th at the World Government Summit in Dubai, he famously proclaimed, "We do need to delete entire agencies. If we don't remove the roots of the weed grows back." Around the same time, the sources report the Trump administration, clearly under DOG's influence, ordered all agencies to summarily fire their recent hires and probationary employees, those with less than a year on the job. Thousands of newer staffers were terminated under this directive without any individual review or process.
And another mass email followed that initial fork in the road message. This sounds chaotic.
Yes, compounding the chaos, DOGE also reportedly blasted out another email demanding remaining federal workers list 5 things you did last week or face termination. This chaotic and seemingly unenforceable edict proved difficult to implement and was quietly dropped within days. The sources note that even Trump's own cabinet officials privately mocked it as nonsensical. By February 24th, the White House had to issue a clarification, stating that Musk's blanket email directives were voluntary and that no one would be fired specifically for ignoring them. This public climb down, essentially walking back Musk's most egregious overreach, hinted at growing internal concerns within the administration about DOGE's methods and their real-world impact.
But while the administration was attempting damage control, public and workforce pushback was growing significantly, wasn't it?
Yes. Rank-and-file pushback from federal employees and labor activists became increasingly visible and organized. On February 15th, federal workers and their allies launched Tesla takedown boycotts and protests at Tesla showrooms in cities across the U.S. and eventually worldwide, explicitly decrying Musk's assault on public servants and their jobs.
Hitting him where it hurts, his business.
Exactly. Isolated incidents of vandalism and even arson against Tesla facilities were reported by late March. The Trump administration publicly condemned these attacks as domestic terrorism and vowed to crack down. Still, the very breadth of these protests targeting Musk's core business enterprises clearly signaled that his polarizing role in government was starting to tarnish his business brand and actively energizing the political opposition. By late February, the backlash, both inside federal agencies and among the general public concerned about service disruptions, was in full swing, putting tangible political heat on the entire DOGE initiative.
Despite the growing controversies, Musk remained a potent figurehead for the conservative base, highlighted by a very memorable public appearance at CPAC.
You're referring, of course, to the CPAC stunt on February 23, 2025. Musk made a dramatic and theatrical appearance at the Conservative Political Action Conference that grabbed national headlines and further polarized partisan opinion. Clad in a black MAGA hat, sunglasses, and a gold chain.
Quite the look.
Indeed. Musk mounted the CPAC stage brandishing an actual chainsaw, which he presented as a gift from the right-wing Argentine president Javier Milei. He declared to the roaring crowd, "This chainsaw is for bureaucracy," and gleefully demonstrated how easy it was to cut billions of dollars in an hour using it metaphorically on stage.
Pure, unadulterated political theater. I remember seeing clips of that.
Absolutely. The stunt drew roaring applause from the MAGA crowd, who saw it as symbolizing DOGE's ruthless and necessary cuts to perceived government bloat. However, it also directly crystallized critics' worst fears, visually painting Musk as someone literally taking a chainsaw to essential government functions.
Right, the optics were stark.
Stark is a good word. Democrats immediately seized on the spectacle as proof of the extreme measures the Trump administration, influenced by Musk, was willing to take. Even some moderate Republicans reportedly cringed at the optics and a potentially negative public perception. Nonetheless, President Trump and his allies continued to publicly embrace Musk's showmanship at this stage. House Speaker Mike Johnson even publicly joked about Musk wearing a lot of hats, literal and figurative, in service of the cause. In essence, the CPAC appearance highlighted the rapidly growing partisan divide surrounding DOGE. The GOP's base celebrated Musk's crusade to slay wasteful government, while Democrats and many civil servants saw an attack on essential public services.
And as DOGE's aggressive actions continued, another branch of the U.S. government started to actively intervene, the judiciary. This seems like a critical turning point.
Yes. In early to mid-March 2025, the courts and federal judges truly began to pump the brakes on DOGE's momentum. A significant wave of lawsuits, eventually totaling over 200, according to the sources, were filed by federal employee unions, nonpartisan watchdog groups like the Partnership for Public Service, and Democratic state attorneys general.
Over 200 lawsuits. Wow.
Yeah. And these legal actions quickly started yielding temporary restraining orders and preliminary injunctions against DOGE's most aggressive moves. For instance, in the first week of March, federal judges issued orders that temporarily reinstated thousands of probationary workers who had been summarily fired, finding that their due process rights under federal law had been violated by the sweeping, notice-free terminations.
So the courts stepped in on the firings.
They did. Courts also blocked DOGE from accessing certain sensitive databases, for example, at the Social Security Administration or SSA, pending further review. The judges noted that accessing those records with such broad, unchecked authority likely breached privacy laws designed to protect citizens' personal data.
The courts also seemed to push back specifically on the lack of transparency, didn't they?
Yes, that's highlighted in the sources. One court compelled Musk's team to turn over internal records after allegations that DOGE was deliberately flouting federal transparency laws, including the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. The court specifically ordered those internal records be preserved and eventually released to the public, effectively thwarting DOGE's initial attempts at secrecy surrounding its operations and decision-making. These accumulating legal setbacks clearly slowed the personnel purges and data access significantly.
How did Musk react to this intervention from the judiciary? Not well, I imagine.
The sources report Musk reacted with intense fury on social media. He publicly acknowledged that the judicial system was mounting what he controversially called a judicial coup to thwart President Trump's reforms and DOGE's efforts.
A judicial coup. Strong words.
Yeah, very strong. He repeatedly attacked the judges issuing these rulings, called for their impeachment, and even amplified far-right calls on social media to emulate regimes that had summarily ousted judges en masse to remove perceived political opposition. Such tirades only serve to underscore the serious constitutional questions dogging DOGE's unilateral approach and Musk's apparent disregard for the separation of powers. By mid-March, it was clear that the rule of law and the independent judiciary were proving to be serious roadblocks. Nearly 25 different lawsuits have been filed against DOGE by this point, with most early rulings going squarely against the Trump-Musk agenda. Musk's aggressive tactics were rapidly meeting the reality that sweeping layoffs and attempts to delete agencies could not simply bypass established federal civil service protections, labor laws, and statutory requirements without triggering prolonged and often unfavorable court battles. This clash between DOGE's methods and the courts would prove to be a decisive factor in hobbling the initiative's momentum. Complying with court orders forced DOGE to introduce basic procedural safeguards that inherently undercut their claims of achieving rapid efficiency through unilateral action.
I don't know. Okay, so we've seen how DOGE's aggressive launch immediately hit significant institutional walls. Legal challenges from the courts that slowed its momentum, operational resistance from agencies facing sudden disruption, and a growing chorus of political opposition that started to show up tangibly in public protests and even impacting local elections. Beyond the courts, DOGE's actions created widespread chaos and real disruption within the agencies themselves, didn't they?
Absolutely. Mid-March 2025 saw increasingly erratic implementation, causing internal chaos and leading directly to service disruptions for the public. For instance, on March 15th, the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, announced it would cut 10,000 jobs to comply with Trump's DOGE directive.
Okay.
But within just a few weeks, HHS officials, including Secretary RFK Jr., had to admit that roughly 2,000 of those firings were mistakes. Employees who should not have been terminated were erroneously let go and had to be reinstated.
That must have been an incredibly embarrassing public reversal for the administration. Oops, fired the wrong people.
It was, and it starkly highlights how hasty, large-scale, one-size-fits-all cuts, pushed down without careful agency-level review, were undermining basic governmental functions and competence.
Yeah.
At the same time, Musk's relentless focus on cost slashing began having tangible negative impacts on government services that citizens relied on. The Social Security Administration, for example, saw field offices targeted for closure and phone lines jammed as staff were cut, leading to significant delays in processing benefits for seniors and disabled Americans.
Okay. That's affecting real people directly.
Absolutely. This even prompted Republican lawmakers to privately urge DOGE and the White House to halt certain SSA office closures in their home districts, reacting to constituent complaints.
So even Republicans were starting to feel the political heat from their constituents back home. That's significant.
Yes, the sources indicate that. One GOP congressman, Rep. Tom Cole of Oklahoma, is specifically noted as having intervened when a Social Security office serving 100,000 people in his district was slated for closure.
Oh.
After he raised concerns that an entire region would lose critical access, DOGE reportedly backed down and kept that specific office open. These incidents show that even President Trump's cabinet secretaries and Republican members of Congress were increasingly scrambling to clean up or mitigate the real-world messes created by DOGE's actions, directly contradicting the narrative of smooth, beneficial efficiency. Musk's cuts, implemented with what critics called an axe instead of a scalper, were producing undeniable errors and tangible service disruptions, exactly the kind of highly visible government failure that can be politically lethal. Such self-inflicted wounds increased internal doubts within the administration about DOGE's competence and fed Republican worries about a potential backlash from voters.
The public backlash wasn't limited to the United States either. It spread internationally, right?
No, it intensified and broadened significantly. By late March 2025, the public backlash had become an international phenomenon. On March 30th, thousands of protesters in cities around the world, from San Francisco to Sydney, staged an international day of action, specifically targeting Musk's business enterprises, primarily Tesla.
Wow.
Tesla showrooms were picketed worldwide with the slogan, "Hurting Tesla is stopping Musk," directly linking their protest against DOGE to Musk's business interests. Isolated incidents of vandalism and even arson against Tesla facilities were reported by late March. The Trump administration publicly condemned these attacks as acts of domestic terrorism and vowed to crack down on the protesters.
Still, these protests seem to be having a real effect, not just on Musk's brand, but also politically.
They did. The breadth and international nature of these protests signaled that Musk's highly polarizing role in government was not only tarnishing his business brand, but also actively energizing political opposition on a global scale. And even electoral politics began to reflect this blowback. In Wisconsin's closely watched April 1st Supreme Court election, Elon Musk had poured over $20 million of his personal fortune to support a conservative candidate, even making a high-profile appearance and handing out $1 million checks at a rally.
$20 million, that's a lot of money in a state race.
It is. The sources indicate the race effectively became a referendum on Musk's divisive DOGE efforts, and the conservative candidate lost by a wide margin.
That's a significant outcome, suggesting his involvement might have actively harmed the candidate he was trying to help.
Many observers and analysts specifically blamed Musk's unpopularity and the controversy surrounding DOGE for swinging the contest, as Democrats effectively made him a bogeyman in their campaign messaging, labeling his initiatives as promoting chaos and cruelty. For Republicans, this was a serious warning sign. Musk's increasingly controversial association with the GOP agenda was starting to alienate crucial swing voters and actively galvanize Democratic turnout. Internally, some Republican strategists reportedly began fretting that DOGE was rapidly turning into a major political liability ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. Musk's characteristic bravado and confrontational style were clearly coming at a tangible political cost to Tesla's stock, which reportedly plunged amid boycotts, to GOP election prospects, and increasingly to the unity of purpose within the Republican Party itself.
And it sounds like some Republicans, even those within the administration, were simply growing tired of the constant drama and controversy surrounding Musk and DOGE. Is that fair?
That's what multiple sources reported. Growing unease among GOP insiders and lawmakers meant they were increasingly tired of Musk's unpredictable antics and social media tirades. People got really sick of him really quickly, one veteran Republican strategist was quoted as observing, noting that Musk had gone from being a fun novelty to a constant source of fatigue and liability by the end. This palpable shift in mood within the party suggested that Musk's period of relatively free reign was coming to an end. Indeed, President Trump, while still praising Musk publicly in a somewhat perfunctory manner, began preparing to transition DOGE's ongoing work away from its celebrity leader and back into more conventional channels. The writing was increasingly on the wall. Musk's 130-day term as a special government employee would legally expire at the end of May, and there was reportedly very little appetite among Republican leaders in Congress or within the administration to bend the rules or extend his official role longer.
Micro recap 2. Okay, let's pause and recap this section. We've seen how DOGE's aggressive launch immediately hit major institutional walls. There were relentless legal challenges from the courts issuing injunctions, slowing momentum and blocking actions. There was operational resistance from agencies facing sudden, chaotic disruption. And there was this growing chorus of political opposition showing up in protests, boycotts, and even impacting elections. Despite some initial Republican enthusiasm, Musk's controversial tactics, the service disruptions, and DOGE's later exclusion from major legislative efforts like H.R. 1 exposed deep divisions within the GOP. And it fueled this relentless, unified opposition from Democrats who effectively turned DOGE into a potent campaign issue.
That covers the core conflicts well, yeah.
On the legislative front, parallel efforts to support DOGE were introduced in Congress, although they seem to have limited success. Can you tell us about those?
Yes, that's noted in the sources. Senator Marshall Blackburn, for instance, introduced a package of bills called the DOGE Acts on February 3, 2025. These included specific legislative proposals aimed at supporting DOGE's goals.
Like what specifically?
Like the Retirees First Act, which proposed lowering Social Security taxes offset by cuts to inefficient non-security discretionary programs. It also included legislation calling for across-the-board spending cuts of 1% for fiscal year 2026, 2% for FY27, and 5% for FY28 and beyond across non-security discretionary spending, with exemptions for defense, homeland security, veterans affairs, and nuclear security.
These seem designed to codify some of DOGE's goals into law, then.
Exactly. These proposals represented a concrete legislative agenda within the Republican Party to try and enact some of the more structural changes DOGE was advocating through executive action. However, the sources note that the fact that these bills largely remained as introduced proposals, referred to committee with limited further action, underscores the inherent difficulties in advancing such broad, aggressive measures through the full, complex legislative process in Congress, even with ostensible party support. It's just hard to get that stuff passed.
And there was also significant legislative pushback from the other side, right? Bills trying to stop DOGE.
Absolutely. Beyond Republican proposals, numerous other DOGE-related bills were introduced, reflecting both support and, notably, very strong opposition. Representative Dave Min, a Democrat from California, introduced H.R. 1535, explicitly titled the Bad DOGE Act on February 24, 2025.
Hey, Bad DOGE Act.
Oh,
Subtle.
not very subtle, no. It was specifically designed to nullify Executive Order 14158, the foundational order that formally established DOGE. This bill, along with others proposed by Democrats with deliberately pointed names like the Taxpayer Data Protection Act, the Merit Act, the Stop Musk Act, the Leash DOGE Act, and the Clear Act, represented a concerted legislative effort by Democrats to dismantle DOGE entirely or severely curtail its powers, increase its transparency, and rein in its authority through statutory means.
Okay, so lots of action, but maybe not much actual legislative change happening on either side regarding DOGE itself. This brings us to a major piece of Republican-led legislation in May 2025, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. This seems like a crucial point in the legislative landscape surrounding DOGE.
It is. This was a significant legislative initiative, officially titled H.R. 1. It was reported by the House Budget Committee on May 20th, 2025, and narrowly passed the House on May 22nd by an incredibly close vote, 215 yeas to 214 nays, which is one member voting present.
Wow, razor-thin margin.
Very thin. It was then transmitted to the Senate for consideration in June.
What was the actual content of this major bill? What was it trying to do?
H.R. 1 was the legislative product of reconciliation instructions under the fiscal year 2025 budget resolution. Reconciliation is a special process in the Senate that allows certain budget-related bills to pass with a simple majority, bypassing the filibuster, but it has specific rules about what can and cannot be included.
Right, bird roll and all that.
Exactly. This bill aimed for a $1.5 trillion deficit reduction target over the fiscal years 2025 through 2034. It sought substantial entitlement and mandatory spending reforms, described by proponents as containing the single largest welfare reform in American history. For example, the House Committee on Agriculture was instructed to achieve a $230 billion reduction, primarily through reforms to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or S1E2.
Food stamps.
Commonly known as food stamps, exactly, including stricter work requirements.
But the nonpartisan analysis of the bill's overall fiscal impact revealed a significant issue, especially regarding its tax provisions, didn't it?
It did. The Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, which is the nonpartisan agency responsible for estimating the cost and fiscal impact of legislation, estimated that the tax provisions within H.R. 1, primarily the extension of the 2017 tax cuts and other new tax reductions, would significantly increase the federal deficit.
Increase it, but it was supposed to be a deficit reduction bill.
Right. The CBO projected this increase to be a staggering $3.8 trillion by the year 2034.
3.8 trillion increase. And this is where, ironically, Elon Musk himself became a very prominent public critic of this major Republican bill. That seems unusual.
Exactly, and the sources highlight this as a key turning point and a remarkable public partisan rift. Musk seized upon this CBO projection that H.R. 1 would increase the deficit, using it as evidence that the bill was fiscally irresponsible. He publicly blasted H.R. 1, calling it a massive spending bill that increases the budget deficit and undermines the work that the DOGE team is doing. This put him openly at odds with President Trump and GOP leaders, who were strongly pushing for the bill's passage.
He even made a rather pointed remark about it in a television interview, didn't he? Something about big versus beautiful.
Yes, in a May 27th interview with CBS News, Musk quipped, "I think a bill can be big or it can be beautiful. I don't know if it can be both," openly criticizing Trump's signature legislative initiative for spending too much and increasing the deficit, despite aiming for stated deficit reduction elsewhere. This public criticism from Musk, the very architect of the administration's cost-cutting initiative, put him at odds with Trump, as CBS News noted, and deeply frustrated many Republicans who felt he was actively complicating their crucial legislative agenda just as they were trying to pass their major bill. Behind closed doors, the sources suggest this public criticism was likely the last straw for many in the GOP and the administration.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Republican strategists reportedly complained that Musk was becoming a loose cannon. After all their efforts to defend DOGE and Musk from criticism, he was now publicly attacking their major tax cut bill. The episode starkly underscored a broader underlying truth. Many Republicans, when push came to shove, prioritized tax cuts and politically popular entitlement reforms over truly aggressive, broad austerity, whereas Musk appeared to be genuinely serious about deep, across-the-board spending reductions. This philosophical gap, previously masked by shared anti-establishment rhetoric, was now fully exposed.
So H.R. 1, the major budget bill aimed at deficit reduction through reconciliation, notably excluded DOGE's claimed savings, which were primarily in the discretionary spending realm. Is that right?
Correct. H.R. 1's perceived beauty or bigness was more in terms of its political symbolism and targeted policy changes like tax cuts and mandatory entitlement reforms, rather than integrating all the touted discretionary savings initiatives from across the administration, particularly DOGE's efforts to cut agency budgets and operations. This exclusion of DOGE's cuts from the major deficit reduction bill, coupled with Musk's public dissatisfaction, clearly laid bare the rift within the Republican coalition regarding the path forward on fiscal policy, and highlighted that DOGE's proposed savings were not being centrally incorporated into the party's primary legislative vehicle for fiscal reform.
Where did Republican leadership say DOGE's claimed savings would end up being implemented, if not in H.R. 1? Did they have an answer for that?
Well, Speaker Johnson stated that the House would use the appropriations process to swiftly implement President Trump's 2026 budget. The appropriations process is how Congress annually allocates discretionary spending the money that funds most government agencies and programs.
Right, separate from mandatory spending like Social Security.
Exactly. This statement implied that DOGE's findings and recommendations for efficiency savings would be incorporated into the regular annual appropriations bills that Congress passes each year to fund federal agencies and programs. The aim was to effectively make these cuts part of the baseline for future government funding. However, these alternative pathways, working through the complex annual appropriations process, carry their own distinct sets of political and procedural challenges, different from those of a reconciliation bill like H.R. 1, and don't necessarily guarantee implementation. It's a whole different fight.
This brings us to the deeper layer of partisan responses and internal conflicts that truly hampered DOGE and ultimately contributed to its demise. It sounds like it wasn't just external opposition.
Absolutely. From its inception, DOGE elicited sharply divergent reactions along partisan lines, significantly exacerbating existing political tensions. Initially, most Republicans, especially those aligned with the MAGA base, lined up enthusiastically behind President Trump and DOGE. They saw it as the direct fulfillment of long-held conservative promises to significantly shrink big government.
Right.
Party leaders publicly praised Musk. President Trump lauded his tremendous help. Attendees at CPAC cheered his appearance, and House GOP lawmakers defended the mass firings as necessary to root out waste. Polls at the time showed that abstract support for downsizing the government was high among Republican voters. Speaker Johnson and the House Republican caucus acted to block Democratic attempts to investigate Musk and DOGE, effectively shielding the initiative from meaningful congressional oversight. The GOP majority on the House Oversight Committee, for example, voted down a Democratic resolution to subpoena Musk for documents and testimony. Republican leaders also reportedly slow-walked information requests from Democrats and watchdogs, brushing off concerns about Musk accessing sensitive data with remarks like, "President Trump controls the purse strings." This widespread party inaction on oversight signaled a tacit approval of DOGE's methods, or at least a strong desire to avoid embarrassing their administration.
But as we discussed earlier with the service disruptions, that initial unity seemed to crack as the real-world consequences became clearer, didn't it?
Yes, a significant rift quietly grew within the GOP itself. Moderate and veteran Republicans, particularly those representing swing districts, grew increasingly anxious about the potential political fallout and practical risks associated with DOGE's aggressive tactics. Sources like Brookings observed that Republican members, seeing the dangers inherent in the DOGE approach, recognizing that indiscriminate, poorly executed cuts could trigger widespread public anger or lead to the collapse of critical government services, directly hurting the GOP's own standing with voters.
Yeah.
By mid-2025, some Republicans, like Rep. Don Bacon, began voicing public misgivings, explicitly disagreeing with Musk's approach of freezing funds and calling the resulting disruption short-lived. Senator Lisa Murkowski, a more moderate Republican, publicly warned that circumventing proper channels creates a tremendous amount of unnecessary anxiety. That is wrong. Good governance is based on trust, not fear.
Strong words from a Republican senator.
Yes. Even Senator Susan Collins, the Republican chairwoman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, a powerful position, voiced worries about Musk's uncontrolled approach, even while generally supporting overall cost-cutting goals.
And crucially, their constituents were making their unhappiness with service disruptions known, putting direct pressure on these lawmakers. That must have been key.
Absolutely. Many rank-and-file GOP lawmakers found themselves caught in a difficult position between loyalty to Trump's agenda and intense pressure from constituents who were directly impacted and upset about real-world service disruptions. Town hall meetings, particularly in swing districts, reportedly grew heated.
Oof.
Rich McCormick, for example, was heavily criticized by constituents over cuts affecting agencies like the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC, which is part of HHS. When he tried to defend the cuts as necessary, constituents shouted him down, telling him that the conservative approach is to take this in a slow and methodical way. That's not happening with DOGE's rapid cuts. Such scenes played out for other Republicans in politically vulnerable districts, prompting some to quietly lobby DOGE in the White House to soften its approach or make exceptions, as Rep. Cole did to save the SSA office in his district.
So behind-the-scenes maneuvering.
Exactly. Despite these growing private and public reservations, Republican leadership's public stance through most of DOGE's lifespan remained largely one of inaction on oversight or denial of the problems. GOP-controlled committees, despite having the power, refused to conduct serious checks on Musk or demand documentation. Politico observed that most Republicans seemed content to let Musk run free, seemingly prioritizing avoiding conflict with Trump over addressing the potential fallout. Even as Senators Murkowski and Collins voiced unease, they generally didn't break ranks on major votes, continuing to support Trump's nominees and priorities. The Republican Party's response to DOGE was visibly fractured enthusiastic hardliners versus nervous moderates. But the party as a whole took very little concrete legislative or oversight action to alter DOGE's course.
Why do you think that was? Fear of Trump, belief in the cuts.
Probably a mix. This inaction was born partly from fear of directly contradicting President Trump, and partly from a belief in the political appeal of the anti-bureaucracy message and spending cuts, at least in the abstract. It wasn't until Musk's antics began to directly threaten the GOP's own key legislative agenda, like with the very public spat over the H.R. 1 budget bill, that Republicans collectively seemed to welcome an end to the experiment.
Right.
By Musk's final month in his role, a GOP strategist conceded that people inside and around the administration were simply tired of Musk and reportedly relieved to see him go. The party that had initially and gleefully embraced Musk's disruptive revolution ultimately let him exit quietly when his term is up, swiftly pivoting their messaging to emphasize more modest, conventional savings initiatives while trying to move past the controversies.
Okay, so that's the Republican side, initial enthusiasm, then growing unease and eventual quiet relief. On the other side, Democrats seem to be uniformly opposed to DOGE from day one and maintain that opposition throughout, right?
Correct. Democrats across the board decried DOGE as an extremist assault on essential government functions and public servants, and they quickly acted as the primary force attempting to hold the initiative accountable. They immediately raised alarms about Elon Musk's unprecedented role, citing his extensive business interests as glaring potential conflicts of interest and arguing that he was an unelected guy wielding enormous inappropriate power over government operations.
Right.
Within President Trump's first month in office, House Democrats on the Oversight Committee launched aggressive moves to expose DOGE's activities, introducing resolutions and sending over 150 investigative letters and requests for documents and information to uncover the details of DOGE's dealings, from the legal basis for mass firings to Musk's access to confidential federal data. They publicly declared House Democrats are leading the fight to bring DOGE out of the darkness.
And they specifically focused on the human impact and real-world consequences of DOGE's actions, didn't they?
Throughout 2025, Democrats effectively used every available platform to highlight DOGE's excesses and put a human face on the layoffs and service disruptions. They held press conferences with federal employee unions and concerned citizens, citing stories of veterans unable to get timely appointments at the Department of Veterans Affairs or VA seniors encountering closed Social Security offices and delays in benefits, and communities losing vital services due to sudden DOGE cuts.
The smart politics.
Very. Democratic leaders also argued that Musk's team was deliberately targeting popular, well-regarded programs as a way to justify later benefit cuts, specifically accusing DOGE of undermining agencies like the SSA to set the stage for Republican cuts to Social Security itself. In April, Senator Brian Schatz quipped that Republicans had effectively walked into a buzzsaw by creating such visible, tangible examples of GOP cuts, validating Democratic warnings about Republican intentions regarding government programs.
And they very quickly turned DOGE into a potent campaign issue, using Musk as the face of it.
Yes, the sources indicate Democrats wasted no time transforming DOGE into a central rallying cry against Republicans. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, or DCCC.
The House campaign arm.
Exactly. And other campaign arms explicitly made Elon Musk the public face of what they called GOP governance, running ads tying vulnerable Republican candidates, particularly in swing districts, to DOGE's perceived chaos and cruelty. One spokesperson was quoted calling Musk the instantly recognizable symbol of Republican misrule.
Wow.
In swing districts across the country, Democratic challengers held town halls with fired federal workers and their families, warning voters that Republicans, if given control, wanted to cut everything from veterans benefits to school funding under the guise of this efficiency initiative. This constant public pressure from Democrats further sensitized moderate Republicans to the potential backlash and helped keep DOG's troubles prominently in the news cycle.
They also pursued institutional checks using their limited power, correct?
Yeah.
Like in the Senate.
Crucially, yes. When House Republicans who held the majority refused Democratic requests to subpoena Musk or key DOGE documents, House Democrats went public with the request, attempting to shame the majority for turning a blind eye. In the Senate, Where Democrats held a narrow majority at the start of 2025, Democratic-controlled committees convened hearings to scrutinize DOGE's impact, asking agency officials tough questions about whether laws were being followed and pressing for details on the cuts and disruptions. And significantly, Democratic state officials filed the numerous lawsuits against DOGE's actions that led to those crucial court injunctions we discussed earlier, effectively using the judiciary to accomplish what they felt Congress, controlled by Republicans, was unwilling or unable to do rein in the executive's overreach.
Right, the courts again.
By March, courts had indeed blocked several key DOGE actions, including the mass firings and unauthorized data access, validating many of the legal arguments Democrats had been raising. While the White House denied lawbreaking, each legal defeat emboldened Democrats to call DOGE a rogue operation acting outside the bounds of the law. Even after Musk's departure, Democrats didn't relent, introducing amendments in spending bills to explicitly prohibit funding for DOGE activities and vowing to dismantle whatever remnants of the initiative remained if they regained a majority in Congress.
Okay.
In summary, the Democratic response was unified, aggressive, and multifaceted, painting DOGE as dangerous executive overreach, mobilizing public opinion against it, and effectively using legislative and legal tools to constrain its power. This relentless opposition not only significantly slowed DOGE's progress, but ensured its shortcomings and controversies were highly visible, which undoubtedly contributed to the loss of broader political support for the initiative.
So, beyond the public partisan split we've discussed, the sources also highlight that internal conflicts within the Republican Party and within the Trump administration itself critically weakened DOGE from the inside. It wasn't just Democrats pushing back.
Yes, a series of internal political conflicts between factions within the Republican Party and within the Trump administration itself led to delays, mixed signals, a loss of focus, and ultimately contributed significantly to the project's downfall.
Yeah.
There were clear factional divisions inside the GOP. Hardline conservatives, especially those aligned with the House Freedom Caucus and Trump's base, were fully committed to Musk's slash-and-burn strategy. They saw DOGE as a once-in-a-generation chance to force deep cuts to agencies and programs long targeted by the right, like the Department of Education, the EPA, the IRS, and the SSA. They cheered Musk's every move and publicly urged President Trump to go faster and further. Rip Pete Stauber, for instance, insisted constituents in his district were thanking him for DOGE's efforts, saying people had voted for these cuts and anyone who didn't see inefficiencies in government got to be blind. He explicitly urged faster and further cuts.
But as you noted earlier, the more establishment or moderate wing of the party seemed much warier, didn't they?
Correct. More establishment and veteran Republicans grew increasingly alarmed by the speed and chaotic nature of DOGE's actions. Experienced lawmakers reportedly worried that dismantling agencies or making such sweeping changes unilaterally could spark a voter revolt or lead to unintended crises that would harm the party. These concerns played out in real time when DOGE targeted sensitive areas like Social Security. GOP lawmakers in politically vulnerable purple or swing districts felt especially exposed, seeing Democrats effectively weaponizing DOGE against them in campaign messaging. They reportedly pressed party leaders, including Speaker Johnson, to scale back DOGE's most disruptive actions or provide more guidance. This intra-party tension led to subtle but persistent pushback.
Like what kind of pushback?
Some Republican senators reportedly insisted that any truly permanent changes to government structure or programs run through Congress slowly, following regular order, not just by executive fiat. Moderate House Republicans reportedly threatened to withhold support from crucial appropriations bills if DOGE's actions hollowed out essential services in their districts. One group of moderate House Republicans reportedly told House leaders they would not back a key budget reconciliation bill like H.R. 1 if it contained the extreme workforce cuts Musk seemed to want, expressing concern over what essential services might be disrupted.
So they use their leverage on must-pass bills.
Exactly. This internal pressure forced GOP leadership to reconsider the scope and method of legislative cuts. We saw the result in the House's One Big Beautiful Bill Act, H.R. 1. While it included many conservative priorities such as stricter work requirements for SNAP and repealing certain programs, it notably stopped short of endorsing the wholesale elimination of major departments or agencies that Musk had publicly advocated for.
Right.
Instead, it focused more heavily on tax cuts. This outcome, as we discussed, reflected input from more cautious Republicans who were worried about the political backlash from cutting popular services. Musk's very public dissatisfaction with H.R. 1 directly laid bare this fundamental rift within the GOP. He wanted deeper, faster cuts, but many in the party balked at the political and practical risks. The tug of war between these GOP factions created legislative delays and resulted in watered-down outcomes that ultimately frustrated Musk's core mission of achieving massive, rapid deficit reduction. DOGE never got the full-throated, unified legislative backing it needed to make its changes permanent, partly because the party itself was divided on how far and how fast to go.
And it sounds like there were also direct internal clashes within the administration itself, beyond just the broader party divisions, like turf wars.
Absolutely. DOGE triggered direct turf wars and philosophical conflicts among high-level officials within the Trump administration.
Mm.
The early reported feud between Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk is one example. Sources indicate Ramaswamy had his own vision and ambitions for government reform that apparently conflicted with Musk's style and priorities. Musk reportedly viewed Ramaswamy as more trouble than help, particularly after Ramaswamy made a disparaging remark about American workers being mediocre, which reportedly irked Trump's circle and gave Musk an opportunity to demand Ramaswamy's removal as co-lead. Musk reportedly successfully iced him out, resolving that specific power struggle in his favor, but arguably losing a potentially stabilizing second perspective and a necessary counterweight within the core DOGE leadership.
Interesting dynamic there.
Beyond that, tension between Musk's DOGE aides and established agency leadership was constant. Career civil servants and even some Trump-appointed agency deputies reportedly resented the DOGE invaders and tried to subtly slow roll or contain damage from sudden, poorly understood directives, moves Musk often interpreted as insubordination or part of the deep state resistance.
Right.
A USAID acting leadership reportedly tried to shield humanitarian programs by citing legal obligations and international agreements, but Musk's team overrode them, viewing it simply as typical bureaucratic obstruction. At the Pentagon, officials reportedly resisted sharing certain data on national security grounds, leading to heated arguments with DOGE staff.
So constant friction.
Yes. This bureaucratic infighting and resistance significantly bogged down DOGE's progress in certain areas, such as Musk's reported attempt to gain access to intelligence agency payrolls. Cabinet secretaries sometimes had to step in to referee disputes between DOGE and their departments, and sources suggest some cabinet members quietly sided with their agencies, trying to protect their missions from what they saw as unwarranted or harmful interference.
Like who? Any examples?
For example, Energy Secretary Rick Perry reportedly objected strongly to a DOGE proposal to sell off national research labs as surplus property, leading to an internal debate that delayed action. These policy disputes and turf battles, pitting Musk's radical cost-cutting goals against established program missions and legal constraints, created an undercurrent of constant conflict within the administration, reducing DOGE's effectiveness and forcing President Trump's officials to devote significant energy to internal mediation rather than external action.
It even sounds like President Trump's inner circle had doubts about Musk by the end. Is that right? That they were tired of the drama?
Reporting from sources like Fox News and Politico indicates that by April 2025, many in Trump's orbit were tired of Musk by the end. Some felt his public grandstanding, like the chainsaw routine, was actively overshadowing President Trump himself, or creating unnecessary controversies that Trump had to answer for. There were whispers that Musk's frequent social media tirades were stepping on the administration's carefully crafted messaging. When Musk attacked federal judges, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt and others reportedly had to field awkward questions about whether the president supported those comments. These persistent side dramas and controversies reportedly irritated senior staff.
I can imagine.
Politico reported an anecdote that junior staffers in Speaker Johnson's office even circulated a darkly humorous meme comparing Musk to Stalin, erasing a disgraced official from a historical photo, reflecting a sentiment that Musk's dominance and sometimes capricious style reminded some of the chaos from Trump's earlier administration.
Wow, a Stalin meme. That's telling.
It is. In short, DOGE, far from being a smooth efficiency operation, rekindled the kind of internal infighting and competing priorities reminiscent of the worst periods of Trump's first term. Competing egos and conflicting priorities within the administration and the party led to a less coordinated and less effective government overall. By May, Chief of Staff Susie Wiles and other senior advisors reportedly recommended to President Trump that it was time to pivot away from Phase 1, the Musk-led shock therapy approach, to a Phase 2, where cabinet secretaries would be empowered to implement more gradual, conventional efficiency measures within their own agencies. This growing internal consensus to move on made it politically much easier for the White House to simply let Musk exit when his official 130-day term as a special government employee was set to expire.
Micro recap, too. So, to quickly reflect on this chapter, DOGE's trajectory was marked by intense conflict from the very beginning. This included internal power struggles within the administration, direct clashes with agency staff resisting sweeping changes, significant legal battles in court that consistently slowed its momentum and blocked its actions, and this rapidly growing partisan divide that turned Musk into a political lightning rod. Despite some initial Republican support, his controversial tactics, the service disruptions, and the initiative's later exclusion from major legislative efforts like H.R. 1 exposed deep divisions within the GOP and fueled a relentless, unified opposition from Democrats, who effectively used DOGE's troubles to campaign against Republicans.
Yeah, that captures the turbulence of that period.
End of chapter, mega recap 2. This chapter powerfully highlights the perfect storm of political and institutional resistance that ultimately hampered DOGE's progress and led to its effective demise. Clearly shows that even significant presidential backing and a celebrity leader known for disruption couldn't simply overcome the fundamental checks and balances within the U.S. government, the deep-seated resistance of the bureaucracy, and the intense partisan chasm that defines Washington politics. Here are some key facts to remember from this period.
Okay.
DOGE faced over 200 lawsuits, primarily from unions and watchdog groups, leading to court injunctions against its most aggressive actions.
The infamous fork-in-the-road email offering buyouts and implying firings was sent to over 2 million federal workers.
Over 5,600 USAID employees were reportedly fired in a matter of weeks during one particularly aggressive purge.
H.R. 1, a major budget bill pushed by House Republicans, was projected by the nonpartisan CBO to increase the federal deficit by $3.8 trillion over 10 years due to its tax provisions.
Elon Musk publicly criticized H.R. 1, stating it undermined DOGE's work on deficit reduction, creating a public rift with Republican leadership.
DOGE's rapid cuts caused real-world service disruptions, including delays at the Social Security Administration and issues at the VA, prompting constituent complaints to lawmakers.
Republicans were divided on DOGE's approach, with moderates and veteran lawmakers growing increasingly anxious about political backlash from their constituents.
While finally, Democrats launched investigations, filed lawsuits, and actively used DOGE's controversies to campaign against Republicans in elections.
Okay, Chapter 3. The savings that vanished. What didn't make the budget? This gets to the core claim, doesn't it? The money.
Absolutely. One of the most significant and persistent areas of controversy surrounding DOGE, and ultimately a key factor in undermining its credibility, was the intense scrutiny of its claimed savings. The very large figures promoted by DOGE and the White House were subject to immediate and significant criticism from various quarters.
Like who?
Including independent media analyses, nonpartisan watchdog groups like the Partnership for Public Service and the GAO, and budget experts across the political spectrum. These critiques consistently question not only the sheer magnitude of the claimed savings, but also the methodology used to calculate them and the overall transparency behind the claims.
And there seemed to be a massive discrepancy between the headline numbers Musk and the White House touted and what could actually be verified or substantiated in public documentation. Is that right?
Absolutely. A notable and recurring issue was the lack of detailed public substantiation for those aggregate savings figures. A BBC analysis in April 2025 specifically examined DOGE's then claimed $175 billion in savings, a figure Musk and the White House continue to cite as of May 29th.
Okay, $175 billion claimed. What did the BBC find?
The BBC found that only $61.5 billion of this total amount was itemized in any publicly available documentation provided by DOGE or the administration. Furthermore, supporting evidence detailing how these itemized savings were actually achieved, the specific contracts terminated, the programs cut, etc., was available for a mere $32.5 billion of that figure.
So out of $175 billion claimed, only about $32.5 billion had verifiable public evidence behind it. That's a substantial gap, like most of it was unsubstantiated.
It is a very substantial gap. This vast difference between the headline number and the verifiable, itemized cuts pointed to a significant lack of transparency and raised very serious questions about the actual basis for the overwhelming majority of the claimed savings. The inability or unwillingness of DOGE to provide a clear, audible trail for such enormous claimed sums inherently undermined the credibility of their overall pronouncements about fiscal responsibility and efficiency.
And beyond just the lack of documentation, there were explicit critiques of the specific methodology DOGE used to calculate these savings, weren't there? The funny math.
Yes, this was a major point of contention. A common critique highlighted in the sources was that DOGE often calculated savings based on the maximum potential value of a contract over its entire lifespan. including all possible extensions and options over many years, rather than calculating the actual amount obligated or the realistic value of the contract at the time it was terminated. This inflated the savings number significantly.
Could you give us an example of that methodology in action?
Yeah, the sources cite the claimed $2.9 billion saving from the termination of a contract with a group called Family Endeavors as a key example. Independent analyses contrasted this figure with an estimated actual saving closer to $153 million.
Okay. $2.9 billion claimed, $153 million actual. Big difference.
Huge difference. The reason for the discrepancy was that the $2.9 billion figure represented the maximum potential value if the contract had been fully utilized and extended over its entire potential duration, whereas the actual obligated funds and the realistic value when terminated were much, much lower. Similarly, the American Enterprise Institute, or AEI, a conservative think tank, conducted an analysis suggesting that DOGE's broad claims of $140 billion in savings from contract cancellations across the government were more realistically around $10 billion based on actual obligations. Nat Malkus from AEI estimated actual savings to be around $80 billion overall, asserting that DOGE was overestimating contract values by a factor of 2 and explicitly employing a funny math definition of savings.
$80 billion is still a lot, but way less than the hundreds of billions claimed.
Absolutely. And AEI also pointed out a crucial legal and procedural detail. Money is not technically saved for the government until Congress formally approves the rescission of those funds. Simply stopping a contract or pausing spending doesn't automatically reduce the national debt unless Congress takes action to claw back that appropriated money.
That's a really important point. It wasn't just methodology issues either. The wall of receipts itself, which was supposed to be their symbol of transparency, was reportedly full of errors.
Yes, the wall of receipts was reportedly plagued by numerous errors and inaccuracies, further undermining its credibility as a transparent accounting tool. These included instances of what auditors called triple or even quadruple counting of claimed savings, essentially counting the same dollar amount multiple times.
Seriously, quadruple counting.
Yeah. A particularly high-profile and embarrassing error involved an $8 million contract with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE.
ICE, right.
It was initially and erroneously reported on the wall of receipts as generating an $8 billion saving.
Million versus billion. Oops.
Big oops. This was later corrected, but the sheer scale of the initial error was notable and widely reported.
And they claimed savings from things that weren't really cuts in the conventional stuff, like expiring leases.
Correct. The list of claimed savings included terminating leases that were already set to expire naturally anyway, such as the Carter Center lease after President Jimmy Carter's death, or for office spaces that were already unused and effectively vacant, such as a USDA office in Topeka, Kansas, that had reportedly been vacant for 3 years.
So claiming credit for things happening anyway.
Pretty much. Savings were also claimed for canceling contracts that had already expired. For example, a $38 million saving was claimed for canceling an expired COVID wastewater monitoring contract, which, according to the sources, had in fact been superseded by a new, more expensive $41 million contract to continue the monitoring.
Oh, that's not saving money.
No. This persistent pattern of errors, questionable methodologies, and lack of full transparency, even in the face of sustained public and expert scrutiny, strongly suggests that the wall of receipts may have functioned primarily as a political communication tool rather than as a rigorous or accurate accounting ledger.
More PR than P&L.
You could say that. Its primary purpose appeared to be the projection of an image of massive, rapid success and the validation of DOGE's disruptive agenda, rather than a good faith effort to provide an accurate and comprehensive assessment of its actual fiscal impact. The flexible definition of savings employed, seemingly engineered to produce the largest possible headline figures regardless of accounting principles, further points to the heavy politicization of the initiative's stated goals. A summary table compiled from various sources including CBS News, Wikipedia, BBC, the Partnership for Public Service, and the GAO consistently showed this significant discrepancy between claimed and verifiable savings and highlighted the criticisms of the methodology.
And the counter-narrative went even further than just saying savings were overstated. Some analyses suggested DOGE might have actually cost the government money in the long run. How did that argument work?
That's right. A crucial counterpoint to DOGE's highly publicized claimed savings was the argument that its disruptive actions incurred significant hidden or unacknowledged costs that could potentially outweigh any savings. These costs included substantial litigation expenses from the hundreds of lawsuits filed against DOGE.
Right, those 200 plus lawsuits.
Exactly. Also, a significant loss of productivity across the federal workforce due to widespread turmoil, anxiety, and demoralization, the administrative expense and confusion of rehiring employees who have been mistakenly fired, and the very real costs of disruptions to essential public services.
This is where the Partnership for Public Services analysis was particularly impactful, wasn't it? The net cost idea.
Yes, perhaps the most striking and widely cited counter-narrative came from the Nonpartisan Partnership for Public Service, a highly respected organization focused on the effectiveness of the federal government. Their analysis concluded that, far from saving money, DOGE's actions could actually impose a net cost on the government, which they estimated could be as high as $135 billion in that fiscal year alone.
A cost of $135 billion, not a saving.
Correct, a potential net cost. This projected cost was directly attributed to factors like the significant lost productivity resulting from the widespread disruption and workforce turmoil caused by the mass firings and changes in employee status. Max Stier, the CEO of the Partnership for Public Service, elaborated that the sheer scale of the upheaval, encompassing firings, buyouts, and early retirements, affecting over 260,000 federal workers.
Wow, over 250,000 people affected.
Along with the consequent dip in overall output and morale, could conservatively equate to roughly half of the federal government's estimated $270 billion annual payroll, translating into a potential loss of $135 billion in productivity and efficiency for that fiscal year.
That assessment fundamentally challenged the entire premise of DOGE as a cost-saving venture. That's true, it's the exact opposite of their goal.
It did. Similarly, a GAO analysis referring to DOGE's claim of about $170 billion in savings at that time suggested that real verifiable savings might be maybe 1/10 to 1/5 of that claim, reiterating that claims were significantly overstated and, critically, that only Congress has the legal authority to formally cut or rescind spending, not an executive initiative.
Right, back to the power of the purse.
Exactly. The consistent omission of these substantial incurred costs from DOGE's public messaging meant that the initiative presented a fundamentally one-sided and misleading picture of its financial achievements. A true and comprehensive assessment of DOGE's fiscal impact would necessitate a net calculation, factoring in both purported savings and the real costs incurred by its disruptive methods, a calculation that DOGE itself did not provide and which external analyses strongly suggested could yield a negative overall figure.
Oh no. Let's lock in the key points about the claimed savings and the counterarguments. The headline savings figures promoted by DOGE were widely disputed by independent analyses, who highlighted flawed methodologies, errors on the wall of receipts, and argued that the disruptions caused by DOGE likely incurred significant unacknowledged costs, with one group estimating a potential net cost as high as $135 billion, fundamentally challenging the idea that DOGE was saving money.
That's the core of the savings debate, yeah.
All of this scrutiny, controversy, and internal conflict seems to set the stage for Elon Musk's eventual departure from his active role. When did that happen exactly?
It does. Elon Musk's departure from his active day-to-day role in leading DOGE was publicly announced around May 30th, 2025. This timing notably coincided precisely with the expiration of his 130-day term limit as a special government employee.
The 130-day limit. Convenient timing.
Very convenient. He stated his intention to rededicate himself to his various private business enterprises, including Tesla, SpaceX, and X.
Did the White House frame this as an end to his involvement or something else? How did they spin it?
They tried to put a positive spin on it. Despite his formal departure and the expiration of his term, President Trump suggested publicly that Musk was not really leaving and would maintain an ongoing presence, being back and forth to the White House in an advisory capacity. Musk himself publicly expressed confidence that DOGE could gain momentum and continue its work even without his constant presence.
Okay.
However, his exit occurred against the undeniable backdrop of significant controversy surrounding DOGE's methods, its widely reported failure to meet its initial ambitious savings goals, and the documented negative impacts of its disruptive actions. In the period immediately leading up to his departure, Musk had also become more publicly critical of certain administration actions, notably that large spending bill, H.R. 1, that he felt directly undermined DOGE's cost-cutting objectives.
Right, the bigger, beautiful comment?
Exactly.
There was even a final, rather symbolic White House event for his departure, wasn't there? With a key.
Yes. On May 30th, 2025, there was a choreographed event in the Oval Office to mark the occasion. President Trump presented Musk with a large golden key in a wooden box, symbolizing unlocking savings and government efficiency, and lavishly praised the tech mogul for his tremendous help. Trump again insisted that Musk was not really leaving and would always be with us helping all the way. Musk, too, struck a positive tone at the event, claiming DOGE had already achieved significant impacts and would eventually hit $1 trillion in cuts over time. Though this boast was met with considerable skepticism from analysts and the media.
Yeah, over time he's doing a lot of work there. But beneath the positive rhetoric in the ceremony was the initiative effectively over as a disruptive force.
That's what the sources indicate. Beneath the cordial theatrics, DOGE as an active disruptive force driven by an outside figure was effectively dead. Elon Musk's departure, while framed as a natural transition, marked the collapse of the initiative's primary driving force and public figurehead. In just over 4 months, DOGE had claimed to slash only about $165 million to $175 billion in spending, an enormous figure on its face, but a staggering distance from the initial ambitious promise of $2 trillion.
A tiny fraction, really.
Yes. And as we've just discussed, many of those claimed savings were either tied up in court challenges or represented one-time accounting maneuvers with questionable methodology that were unlikely to translate into long-term deficit reduction without congressional action. The Associated Press dryly noted that Musk cut less than he wanted before leaving, despite putting a significant spotlight on federal spending. The experiment of putting an outsider billionaire, known for rapid, aggressive corporate restructuring, in charge of unilaterally attempting to dismantle parts of the federal government has seemingly reached its breaking point. It was ultimately brought down by the combination of legal hurdles imposed by the courts, significant public and workforce backlash, deep political infighting within the GOP, and its failure to translate claimed savings into tangible legislative achievements or sustained deficit reduction.
What happened to DOGE in the aftermath of Musk's departure? Did it just disappear?
In June 2025 and beyond, the White House attempted to maintain a positive spin and suggested the effort would continue without Musk's direct involvement. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt announced that President Trump and his cabinet secretaries would now directly spearhead DOGE's mission, with existing DOGE staffers being converted into political appointees inside each agency to continue the work.
Okay, embedding them formally.
Right. Surely the mission of DOGE will continue, Leavitt insisted, saying every cabinet secretary was committed to rooting out waste within their departments. A senior official reportedly claimed that DOGE was now part of the DNA of government, representing a permanent mindset shift, and that its work had only just begun.
But did the momentum really continue at the same pace or with the same scope, or was that just talk?
In reality, according to sources, the momentum largely fizzled without Musk's galvanizing, though often divisive, presence and direct White House-backed authority. While isolated cost-cutting initiatives undoubtedly carried on at agencies, they did so under much more conventional channels and scrutiny. There were no new grand mandates for mass layoffs, agency reorganizations, or attempts at wholesale department eliminations after mid-2025.
So the radical phase was over.
Pretty much. By early 2026, watchdogs were noting that DOGE had largely identified only a fraction of the promised $2 trillion in savings, and its boldest, most disruptive proposals, like abolishing entire departments or implementing Schedule F to easily fire career civil servants, had stalled or were tied up in court. Schedule F, by the way, was that proposed executive action that would have reclassified potentially tens of thousands of federal employees, stripping them of civil service protections and making them much easier to hire and fire at will based on political considerations.
Right, Schedule F, that was hugely controversial, so that stalled too.
It did.
And politically, did Republicans continue to embrace the DOGE brand after Musk left? Or did they try to distance themselves?
No, the sources indicate a clear shift. In the political aftermath, Republicans began actively distancing themselves from the DOGE fiasco. On the 2026 campaign trail, Democrats continually hammered Musk's tenure as proof that Republicans cared more about billionaires than ordinary Americans, using the service disruptions and chaotic firings as key examples. Sensing the political danger, many GOP candidates, particularly in swing districts, stopped touting DOGE's claimed cuts and quickly returned to more standard Republican rhetoric on tax relief, job creation, and conventional fiscal conservatism. In essence, by the time Congress next convened for budget hearings, the DOGE initiative was widely seen, even by some Republicans, as a cautionary tale, an object lesson in the perils of governing by executive fiat and pursuing internecine zeal.
A cautionary tale.
Yes. Some Republicans came to quietly acknowledge that DOGE's most disruptive moves had backfired politically and operationally. Rep. Blake Moore, for instance, mused publicly about the need for genuine budget reform, saying, "Time will tell if we can do this in a thoughtful, systematic way, but we're going to need Democrats to work together." a statement that stands in stark contrast to the unilateral slash-and-burn approach that DOGE had initially epitomized.
That's a big shift from the chainsaw at CPAC.
A very big shift.
So if we step back and sum up the primary reasons for DOGE's failure, what were the key hurdles it couldn't overcome? You mentioned legislative, procedural, and internal factors before.
All right, we can recall several key roadblocks, as detailed in the sources, that ultimately prevented DOGE from achieving lasting, fundamental success. First, there was the crucial lack of congressional authorization. DOGE was created and empowered almost entirely by executive order, not by an act of Congress. This severely limited its legal ability to abolish or fundamentally reorganize cabinet-level departments or mandatory programs, such as Social Security or Medicare, which requires specific legislation to change. Musk could recommend or attempt de facto actions, but these departments legally existed with congressionally mandated missions and budgets.
And the power of the purse, which belongs to Congress, seemed to be a major obstacle, as we've discussed.
Absolutely critical. Budgetary control, the constitutional power of the purse, resides solely with Congress. While DOGE aimed to drastically cut or redirect spending, it constantly ran into the fact that only Congress can appropriate funds and formally rescind them, take back money already allocated. Right. Musk's team tried creative methods to intercept or redirect spending downstream, like instructing agencies to pause or claw back grant programs, or telling the Treasury Department to hold off on dispersing funds. These actions repeatedly tested legal limits and provoked procedural showdowns, like the clash with the House Ways and Means Committee over DOGE attempting to gain broad access to Treasury payment systems. The outcry and legal challenges spotlighted the legal dubiousness of an unelected team attempting to stop the flow of funds that Congress had explicitly approved. Court injunctions were quick to freeze such moves, citing Congress's constitutional budget authority and even citing the Impoundment Control Act, a federal law that prevents the executive branch from unilaterally withholding appropriated funds.
And eventually, Congress itself acted to specifically reassert that authority, didn't they, in a budget deal?
Yes. In a bipartisan budget deal that passed later in the year to avert a potential government shutdown, lawmakers quietly included specific provisions that effectively reappropriated any funds that had been de-obligated or frozen by executive action back to their original congressionally intended purpose, essentially nullifying many of DOGE's attempted freezes and clawbacks. Congress's power of the purse proved to be a truly formidable check on DOGE's unilateral ambitions, one that Republicans in Congress never fully ceded and which Democrats effectively leveraged through arguments and litigation, resulting in significant procedural blocks on DOGE's ability to achieve unilateral cost cuts.
The judiciary, as we discussed, was also a major and immediate procedural hurdle throughout.
Judicial intervention perhaps imposed the most immediate and consistent hurdles. Beginning in March, federal judges across the country issued temporary restraining orders or preliminary injunctions against key DOGE initiatives. For example, a judge ruled that summarily firing thousands of probationary employees without notice or explanation violated their fundamental due process rights under the Constitution and federal law and ordered them reinstated.
Right, due process.
Another court found that DOGE staff attempting to gain broad access to sensitive SSA personal records likely breached federal privacy laws and barred further access. Judges also compelled compliance with federal transparency laws like FOIA, ordering the preservation and eventual release of internal DOGE records, directly thwarting the initiative's attempts at secrecy.
These legal roadblocks didn't just slow DOGE down, they fundamentally changed its approach, it sounds like.
Exactly. They also set important precedents that significantly narrowed what Musk and DOGE could legally do going forward. Musk may have complained that judges were legislating from the bench, but in practice, DOGE was increasingly forced to start observing established legal processes, providing justification for personnel actions, undergoing required OMB reviews for data access requests, and generally operating within the bounds of the law rather than unilaterally. This significantly tamed their ability to act quickly and disruptively. Long-standing federal civil service protections and labor laws also proved to be sturdy defenses against the mass firings. The attempt to use Schedule S, the proposed reclassification to make firing easier, got immediately tied up in court challenges and faced significant bipartisan opposition in Congress. DOGE sometimes overstepped its legal authority, for instance, firing people in roles explicitly protected by statute, leading to clear legal wins for plaintiffs. One count tallied 25 separate lawsuits by mid-March alone, with almost all early rulings going against the administration or resulting in settlements favorable to the plaintiffs. In essence, the law acted as a brake on the runaway train, and complying with court orders, or being blocked by them, introduced procedural safeguards and limitations that fundamentally undercut DOGE's claims of achieving rapid efficiency through unilateral executive action.
And then there's simply the sheer scale and complexity of governing a massive bureaucracy like the US federal government. That had to be a factor.
That's right, procedural complexity. Some roadblocks were simply the innate difficulty of governing a sprawling, complex bureaucracy that spends trillions of dollars annually. Announcing $2 trillion in cuts is one thing, but finding and executing those cuts within procedural confines, legal constraints, and the reality of how government programs actually function is incredibly arduous. Much of government spending is locked in for years through multi-year contracts, mandatory entitlements written into law like Social Security and Medicare, or statutory grant formulas that can't be easily cut without enacting new laws or breaching existing contracts, which often triggers significant penalty fees. Reclaiming unspent funds required specific procedural steps like notifying Congress under the Impoundment Control Act, adding layers of complexity and potential delay.
Right.
These procedural nuances meant some of DOGE's loudly advertised savings either evaporated upon closer inspection or were far less than initially advertised. Facing these hurdles, Musk reportedly kept revising DOGE's goalposts and definitions of what constituted a saving. The roughly $175 billion claimed by May, while still a large number, primarily came from selling surplus federal property, eliminating a few narrowly defined duplicate programs, and tighter fraud detection, what many analysts called low-hanging fruit, that while real was a drop in the bucket of a $6 trillion federal budget.
So the big cuts never yet happened.
The really big ticket savings Musk envisioned, the trillions, never materialized because procedurally they were either illegal without congressional action or simply too time-consuming and complex to deliver immediate budget impacts. This procedural inertia and complexity deeply frustrated Musk and made it incredibly difficult for him to show the kind of dramatic, rapid results he seemed to crave.
And Musk's own limited time in the role, that 130-day window, seemed to exacerbate that pressure for rapid results, possibly leading to some of the more flawed actions we talked about.
An often overlooked but significant procedural factor was the timeline constraints imposed by Musk's term limit. By using the special government employee appointment status, Musk was legally limited to 130 days of service within a one-year period to avoid stringent conflict of interest rules that apply to full-time government officials.
Okay.
So from his start date around January 20th, Musk's clock was ticking down to late May. While it was theoretically possible for the administration to find ways to extend his role or transition him to a different status, they ultimately chose not to. This ticking clock undoubtedly put immense pressure on DOGE to show tangible results fast, arguably contributing to some of the rash moves we discussed, like the mass emails and swift firings, in an attempt to make numbers and demonstrate impact before his term was up. Moreover, once it became clear within the Republican Party that extending Musk's controversial role would be politically difficult or undesirable, Republicans in Congress had little incentive to take up or prioritize major DOGE legislation that might solidify or extend his influence. Some Republicans were reportedly even relieved that he had a built-in exit date in May, seeing it as a politically convenient chance to reset the administration's efficiency messaging without a formal confrontation with Trump over Musk.
So the limit became an easy out.
The 130-day cap effectively served as a built-in procedural fail-safe and a politically convenient off-ramp. The White House ultimately cited simple compliance with the legal limit his term has expired as the reason for his departure, avoiding any direct admission to failure while neatly ending the most contentious and disruptive phase of the initiative. The lack of significant action by Republicans to extend his term, despite his initial high profile, is telling.
And finally, wrapping it all together are those internal political conflicts we discussed earlier within the GOP, within the administration. They really seem to hamstring the effort.
Right. The significant internal political conflicts, both within the Republican Party, between hardline conservatives pushing for maximum speed and depth, and more moderate or veteran lawmakers concerned about political backlash and operational chaos. And within the administration itself, from the Musk versus Ramaswamy dynamic to the constant tension between DOGE aides and agency cabinet leadership, and the philosophical split between deficit hawks like Musk and those prioritizing tax cuts or specific programs, these conflicts sapped unity, diluted focus, and ultimately undermined DOGE's momentum at almost every turn. Republican leadership's inaction in the face of mounting warnings about DOGE's methods and impacts allowed problems to fester rather than be proactively addressed. They never fully resolved the fundamental split between the abstract desire for deep cuts and the political and practical caution needed for responsible governance. They largely stood by as alarms grew louder, ultimately finding it easier to simply let Musk's clock run out and allow the most disruptive phase of the initiative to collapse under the weight of its own unrealistic goals and lack of broad, unified political support.
So it just sort of withered.
In summary, yes, the procedural and legislative guardrails inherent in the U.S. system, combined with internal political divisions and a lack of sustained, unified political will, profoundly shaped the trajectory and ultimate outcome of DOGE. The combination of lacking a clear congressional mandate, facing strong and effective legal challenges from the judiciary and civil society, and the sheer inherent bureaucratic complexity of the federal government meant that DOGE's most dramatic unilateral ambitions were consistently curtailed. The Republican-led government, whether by choice, strategic calculation, or inertia, never fully cleared these fundamental hurdles. They did not successfully change the necessary laws, they did not override court decisions blocking DOGE's actions, and they did not fundamentally alter civil service rules or bureaucratic processes in a way that would facilitate DOGE's desired speed and scope. This inertia, effectively Republican inaction in pursuing legislative solutions to DOGE's obstacles, left the initiative hemmed in. Over a short few months, these political, legal, and procedural roadblocks transformed what began with the aspiration of being a lasting overhaul of government into a series of transient executive actions, many of which were quickly reversed or halted by courts, agencies, or Congress itself. In the end, the system's established checks and balances and the GOP's own internal divisions and hesitancy to fully bulldoze them ensured DOGE's collapse as a major disruptive force.
Looking back, what are the key lessons we can take away from this whole episode, this rapid rise and fall of DOGE? What does it teach us?
Well, the DOGE episode serves as a powerful and perhaps cautionary case study in the limits of attempting shock therapy as a method for large-scale governmental reform. It suggests that without genuine legislative buy-in, careful coalition building across branches and even within parties, and a deep understanding of the system's complexities, a radical executive-driven initiative will inevitably hit institutional brick walls erected by law, procedure, and political reality.
Right.
The sources highlight that Republican inaction, the party failing to pass legislation to codify DOGE's changes, failing to grant it statutory authority, or failing to rein in Musk when controversies mounted, was arguably as culpable for DOGE's failure to achieve lasting impact as the unified Democratic resistance. GOP leaders effectively allowed DOGE to wither by neglect, rather than proactively support or correct it.
And the internal conflicts we discussed played a big role in that failure, too.
Those internal political conflicts, both within the GOP and within the administration, eroded effectiveness at every turn. Instead of functioning as a coordinated campaign for reform, DOGE became bogged down in a series of factional battles and turf wars that dissipated any potential momentum for real, sustained change. As one observer quoted in the sources noted, government reform isn't rocket science, it's way harder. And the DOGE episode, with its layers of political and procedural complexity, certainly proved that point.
Yeah, seems like it. What about the overall legacy of DOGE? What did it leave behind?
The legacy of DOGE is perhaps best viewed as a reminder that lasting, impactful government change requires broad consensus, consistent transparency, and a fundamental respect for established processes and the rule of law. It stands as a significant case study of a partisan experiment and radical change gone awry within the U.S. system. When we assess DOGE's stated goals, the outcomes are highly questionable. Claimed spending cuts were highly contested, widely seen as overstated, potentially offset by significant costs, and certainly nowhere near approaching the initial $1 trillion to $2 trillion target.
Right.
Efficiency and productivity gains are highly dubious. While IT modernization held theoretical potential, the mass firings, workforce turmoil, and service disruptions likely harmed overall government efficiency and effectiveness in the short to medium term. Accountability and transparency, ironically, were recurring points of failure. DOGE's own wall of receipts was criticized for errors and opacity, and the initiative faced numerous lawsuits directly related to its lack of transparency and accountability in its actions.
So the key takeaways seem to be about balancing ambition with practicality and respecting the system itself. Is that a fair summary?
Exactly. The sources point clearly to the importance of balancing the desire for change and disruption with the necessary stability of government functions, respecting due process and the rule of law, preserving institutional knowledge and the value of the career civil service, and ensuring ethical technology use, especially concerning broad data access and surveillance powers. There are clear limitations to applying purely outsider or corporate restructuring models to the public sector. While fresh perspectives can be valuable, they must be integrated with an understanding and respect for established governmental norms, legal constraints, and the unique values of public service, which are distinct from corporate goals.
It's not just another company to fix.
Precisely. The heavy involvement of tech figures and a focus on applying technological solutions to seemingly intractable government problems reflected a certain technocratic belief that complex governance problems can be solved primarily through technology, data, and top-down managerial efficiency, like optimizing a company. But this approach frequently clashed head-on with the more deliberative, value-laden, and legally constrained processes inherent in democratic governance. The resulting controversies and ultimate failure highlight the fundamental limitations of attempting to apply purely technocratic or corporate restructuring models to the public sector without accounting for its unique legal, political, and human dimensions.
End of chapter Mega Recap 3. Bringing it all together, the ambitious promise of trillions in government savings championed by DOGE and Elon Musk evaporated under intense scrutiny, replaced by analyses suggesting the initiative potentially imposed a significant net cost. DOGE's aspirations for radical, rapid change were ultimately kneecapped by the realities of legal and procedural constraints, deep internal administration conflicts and Republican Party divisions, and a lack of sustained, unified political will necessary to overcome resistance. This eventually led to Musk's departure and the effective end of the initiative's disruptive phase. Here are some crucial final facts from this part of the story.
Okay, let's hear them.
Independent analyses, notably from the Partnership for Public Service, disputed DOGE's savings claims, suggesting the initiative potentially incurred a net cost as high as $135 billion due to lost productivity and turmoil.
The Wall of Receipts, DOGE's transparency tool, was widely criticized for significant errors, questionable methodology like counting potential versus obligated contract value, and lack of substantiation.
The DOGE's lack of congressional authorization and reliance on executive orders fundamentally limited its ability to make permanent structural changes or abolish departments, which requires legislation.
Judicial intervention consistently blocked key DOGE actions, including mass firings, violating due process, and broad data access, potential privacy breaches, forcing compliance with legal procedures.
Internal conflicts within the GOP and the administration, including disagreements over policy and turf wars between DOGE and agencies, undermine the initiative's unity and momentum.
And Elon Musk's 130-day special government employee term limit contributed to the pressure for rapid, often flawed, action and provided a convenient political off-ramp for Republicans growing tired of the controversy.
We've journeyed through the short, incredibly intense life of the DOGE initiative. We saw a vision of efficiency and disruption born from executive power and championed by ambitious figures, only to see it clash headfirst with the deeply ingrained processes, the fundamental legal constraints, and the complex, often messy political dynamics of Washington. The ambitious goals they set, the disruptive tactics they employed, the controversial claims about their impact, and the relentless opposition they faced all combined to tell a compelling story about the immense difficulty and perhaps the fundamental nature of attempting truly radical reform within an established system, especially when driven primarily by a singular figure and attempting to bypass traditional legislative and bureaucratic routes.
The DOGE episode, documented through these sources, really serves as a potent case study, offering valuable lessons not just for policymakers in Washington, but for anyone, anywhere, considering how to implement large-scale change within complex established systems, whether they are governments, large organizations, or even societies.
Right.
It forces us to ask difficult questions. What is the real cost of disrupting established government processes in the name of efficiency, especially when we factor in the hidden expenses like lost productivity, the costs of legal battles, and the damage done to institutional knowledge and workforce morale? Was DOGE's failure to achieve its most ambitious goals inevitable, given its unilateral, executive-driven approach and its disregard for established procedures? Or could a similar initiative, perhaps better executed with more consensus building, more transparency, and a deeper understanding of the system, succeed in the future?
And finally, in a world increasingly fascinated by applying private sector speed, metrics, and efficiency to public problems, where figures known for rapid corporate disruption are sometimes held up as models for fixing government, how do we as a society balance the legitimate desire for reform and efficiency with the absolutely essential democratic values of due process, transparency, accountability to the public, and ensuring that power is accountable to more than just one powerful figure or faction.
Yeah, that's the core tension, isn't it?
What lessons from the death of DOGE, as documented in these sources, should policymakers, technologists, and citizens carry forward when we consider the future of government efficiency and the pursuit of reform? Thinking about everything we've covered today, what stands out most to you from this deep dive?
DOGE didn't collapse because it lacked ambition. It collapsed because ambition wasn't enough. Not in the face of courts, Congress, bureaucracy, or backlash, but the instinct behind it, fast cuts, centralized control, tech-style governance, didn't die with the experiment. It's gone global. From Washington to Beijing, Berlin to Moscow, we follow how trade, sanctions, and supply chains have become the new weapons of modern power.
Please like and subscribe.